The war now unfolding around Iran is no longer just a story about missiles and airstrikes. It is becoming something much bigger and much more dangerous. A conflict where advanced weapons, global energy choke points, and mass civilian displacement are colliding at the same time. On one side, the United States and its allies are bringing a new generation of warfare into the region, including ship-mounted laser systems and space-enabled tracking networks. On another, the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important maritime passages on Earth, is once again proving that a narrow strip of water can shake the entire global economy. And inside Iran itself, the human cost is growing fast, with millions reportedly displaced inside the country as civilians flee major cities and search for safety. This is no longer just a regional military confrontation. It is a war with technological, economic, and humanitarian fronts all unfolding at once. To understand why this moment matters, start with the battlefield itself. Iran has leaned heavily on drones and missiles as tools of pressure, deterrence, and retaliation. That strategy made sense for years because it allowed Tehran to threaten much more expensive militaries with weapons that were relatively cheap to produce and deploy. But the balance may be shifting. The U.S. Navy's Helios system, short for High Importing in early 2025, said the system was used successfully against multiple drones during testing, reinforcing that distinction matters because the future of anti-drone warfare may not depend on one miracle weapon, but on layered systems, some that dazzle, some that damage, and some that cue other defenses into action. That is what makes this moment so important. For years, a central logic of drone warfare was cost asymmetry. A low-cost drone could force an adversary to spend an extremely expensive interceptor missile. But directed energy weapons begin to disrupt that math. According to reporting on recent U.S. Navy testing, laser shots can be dramatically cheaper than conventional interceptors, especially when compared with systems like Patriot missiles that can cost millions per round. Lasers also have another advantage: speed. They do not need the launch and flight sequence of a missile interceptor. If the beam can stay on target long enough, the effect is immediate. That does not mean lasers are replacing missiles tomorrow, and they still face limits from weather, power generation, beam control, and line-of-sight constraints. But they are clearly becoming a serious part of modern fleet defense, especially against drones and possibly some cruise missile-like threats. In other words, what used to sound like science fiction is now part of real military planning. And the laser story does not stand alone. It connects directly to a second transformation in warfare: space-enabled detection and rapid targeting. Recent reporting has described U.S. and allied capabilities to detect launches through infrared sensing from space, track missile activity, and speed up the kill chain from detection to interception or counterstrike. Even where exact systems remain classified or uncertain, the principle is clear. Satellites, sensors, data fusion, and increasingly automated processing are compressing battlefield time. Launches that once created confusion can now create signatures. Heat, movement, and timing can all feed a modern targeting network. That means a missile launcher is no longer just a weapon. It is also a beacon the moment it fires. This is why the war increasingly looks like a contest not only of firepower, but of sensing, timing, and network response. The more connected side sees faster, reacts faster, and punishes exposed launchers faster. But if the first front of this crisis is technological, the second is geographic. The Strait of Hormuz remains one of the world's most consequential choke points. UNCTAD said last week that it carries around a quarter of global seaborne oil trade along with major volumes of liquefied natural gas and fertilizers. When that corridor slows or becomes dangerous, the ripple effects spread immediately across freight rates, insurance costs, energy prices, and food systems. Recent reporting shows exactly that. Shipping through Hormuz has been disrupted sharply, war risk insurance premiums have surged, and oil markets have reacted with sudden price spikes. In the last week alone, international reporting described ships hit in or near the strait, insurers repricing risk, and governments scrambling to find workarounds. That means this war is not only being fought in the skies over the Middle East. It is also being felt at gas stations, in shipping contracts, in fertilizer markets, and ultimately on store shelves far from the region. This is where the second draft you provided becomes especially powerful. The choke point itself is part of the story. The Strait of Hormuz is narrow, strategically exposed, and psychologically potent. Even when traffic is not fully halted, the fear of disruption alone can move markets. That is why alternative routes and bypass ideas always return to the conversation. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have both invested in pipeline routes that reduce dependence on Hormuz, but even expanded bypass infrastructure cannot fully replace what normally moves through the strait. Engineering dreams such as a canal through Oman's Musandam Peninsula sound attractive on paper, but the terrain, cost, politics, and security complications are enormous. Oman's actual planning priorities emphasize development and infrastructure, not cutting a giant mountain canal to redesign global trade geography. So the brutal truth remains the same. The world still depends on this narrow passage, and any sustained conflict around it can trigger consequences far beyond the battlefield. Then comes the third front, and perhaps the most devastating one, the civilian fallout inside Iran. UNHCR said in mid-March that preliminary assessments suggest up to 3.2 million people may now be temporarily displaced inside Iran, with many reportedly fleeing Tehran and other major urban areas toward the north and rural areas. That is a staggering figure, and it matters because it changes the story from a military campaign into a humanitarian emergency. At the same time, UNHCR's update for Armenia said movement at the Agarak border crossing remained open but limited and manageable, with no sign yet of large-scale flows into Armenia. That nuance is important. The crisis is real, but it is not uniform. The main displacement, at least so far, appears to be internal rather than a single, overwhelming cross-border exodus in every direction. Even so, the humanitarian pressure is rising fast, especially because conflict is hitting a country already burdened by sanctions, inflation, resource strain, and infrastructure vulnerability. And that internal pressure may become as strategically important as anything happening at sea. When millions move at once, they do not just need roads. They need shelter, fuel, food, clean water, medicine, communication, and trust that someone is in control. If those systems begin to fail, the result is not only human suffering but state stress. The original draft's emphasis on water and ecological strain also points to something deeper. Wars hit hardest where pre-existing systems are already brittle. UN reporting already frames the situation as a rapidly escalating humanitarian emergency, and broader coverage of the war has linked regional attacks to growing displacement and infrastructure damage. So even without repeating every dramatic estimate from the source drafts, the broader reality is clear. Continued strikes, disrupted services, and sustained fear can turn temporary flight into long-term instability. Put all three of these fronts together, and the picture becomes sharper. Iran and its adversaries are not just fighting over territory or prestige. They are colliding in a war that is simultaneously rewriting three different rulebooks. The first is the rulebook of air defense, where lasers and sensor networks are beginning to challenge the old cost-benefit logic of drone swarms. The second is the rulebook of global trade, where one maritime bottleneck can still send shockwaves through oil, gas, shipping, fertilizer, and inflation. And the third is the rulebook of state resilience, where the ability to absorb civilian displacement may matter as much as the ability to launch missiles. The most dangerous conflicts are the ones where these layers reinforce each other. Military escalation raises shipping risk. Shipping risk raises economic pressure. Economic pressure worsens civilian hardship. Civilian hardship increases political stress, and political stress can drive even riskier military decisions. That is why this war feels different. It is not just about who fires more missiles or destroys more launchers. It is about whether a new military era is arriving in real time. Directed energy weapons are no longer just prototypes on presentation slides. They are being tested, deployed, and discussed as practical answers to the drone age. Space-based sensing is no longer background support. It is central to how modern militaries detect, decide, and strike. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a familiar geopolitical phrase. It is once again an active source of global economic anxiety. And Iran's internal displacement is no longer a side story. It is becoming one of the conflict's defining realities. What happens next will depend on whether this remains a contained regional war or hardens into a wider, longer, more systemically damaging crisis. But even now, one conclusion is hard to avoid. This is no ordinary conflict. It is a preview of how future wars may be fought, how global markets may panic, and how civilian populations may pay the price first and longest. The second is the rulebook of global trade, where one maritime bottleneck can still send shockwaves through oil, gas, shipping, fertilizer, and inflation. And the third is the rulebook of state resilience, where the ability to absorb civilian displacement may matter as much as the ability to launch missiles. The most dangerous conflicts are the ones where these layers reinforce each other. Military escalation raises shipping risk. Shipping risk raises economic pressure. Economic pressure worsens civilian hardship. Civilian hardship increases political stress, and political stress can drive even riskier military decisions. That is why this war feels different. It is not just about who fires more missiles or destroys more launchers. It is about whether a new military era is arriving in real time. Directed energy weapons are no longer just prototypes on presentation slides. They are being tested, deployed, and discussed as practical answers to the drone age. Space-based sensing is no longer background support. It is central to how modern militaries detect, decide, and strike. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a familiar geopolitical phrase. It is once again an active source of global economic anxiety. And Iran's internal displacement is no longer a side story. It is becoming one of the conflict's defining realities. What happens next will depend on whether this remains a contained regional war or hardens into a wider, longer, more systemically damaging crisis. But even now, one conclusion is hard to avoid. This is no ordinary conflict. It is a preview of how future wars may be fought, how global markets may panic, and how civilian populations may pay the price first and longest.